Ever wonder why Sweden needs government approval for your baby's name? Or risk a tax penalty? You live in a world where nations tax everything from beards to sunshine. The tax code isn't just boring paperwork, it's where governments reveal their strangest priorities and deepest fears. When Peter the Great taxed beards to westernize Russia or Greece and used satellites to hunt for undeclared swimming pools, taxation became a theater of the absurd. In this video, we'll journey through taxation's twisted landscape, where chopsticks face levies to save forests and witches must register as taxpayers. Because when it comes to government revenue, nothing is too weird to tax. 1. Sweden's name. Tax law emerged in 1982 when the government decided parents couldn't be trusted to name their own children without supervision. The Swedish tax agency began requiring all baby names to be submitted for approval before becoming official. Parents who ignored this process faced fines and rejection. Why? The government claimed it was protecting children from inappropriate names that could cause offense or be unsuitable for Swedish citizens. In reality, it created a bureaucracy where tax officials could veto names they personally disliked. After international ridicule and multiple legal challenges, the law was reformed, though not abolished. Today, Sweden still maintains this strange system where tax collectors moonlight as baby name critics, determining which creative spellings or unique names are acceptable for future generations. 2. Britain's window. Tax sounds like something invented by a cartoon villain, but it plagued homeowners from 1696 to 1851. The more windows in your house, the more tax you paid. The reasoning was brilliantly terrible. Windows were a visible proxy for wealth that tax collectors could count without entering homes. The unintended consequences were immediate and predictable. Homeowners across Britain began bricking up perfectly good windows to avoid the tax, creating the architectural oddity of blind windows, still visible today. As darkness descended on British interiors, public health suffered. Doctors began documenting higher rates of illness in poorly ventilated, dimly lit homes. Parliament finally abolished the tax in 1851, acknowledging that taxing sunlight and fresh air had been a catastrophically bad idea all along. The legacy lives on in the phrase daylight robbery. 3. Germany's dog tax, Hundesteuer, has been sniffing around wallets since the 19th century. Own a dog in Germany? You'll pay up to $200 annually, depending on which city you call home. The tax was originally implemented to control rabies and stray populations, but now it's mainly about revenue. German cities maintain elaborate dog registries, requiring owners to obtain tax tokens that must be displayed on collars as proof of payment. What happens if you don't pay? Tax inspectors conduct random checks in parks, and fines can exceed $10,000. The system creates bizarre outcomes. Some Germans register their dogs in neighboring towns with lower rates, while others have been caught claiming their German shepherds are wolves to evade the tax. Despite criticism, German municipalities refuse to let this revenue stream off the leash, collecting millions each year from the nation's canine companions. 4. Denmark tried to tax fat people thin with their saturated fat tax of 2011. Any food containing more than 2.3% saturated fat was hit with a surcharge of roughly $2.70 per kilogram of fat. Butter prices soared by 20%, meat became a luxury, and Danes suddenly discovered the joys of cross-border shopping in Germany. The law created a bureaucratic nightmare as manufacturers had to calculate precise fat content in every product and submit endless paperwork. Small producers were crushed under compliance costs. Restaurant owners faced mountains of paperwork trying to calculate the fat tax on their meals. After just 15 months, Denmark admitted defeat and repealed the tax in January 2013. The experiment did reduce saturated fat consumption, not because Danes ate healthier, but because they drove to Germany to buy their butter. It remains the world's most ambitious attempt to tax people's waistlines. 5. France's playing card tax shows how a seemingly trivial tax can reshape an entire industry. Dating back to the 17th century, France required every deck of playing cards to bear a tax stamp, typically on the ace of spades. The tax collector's mark became so intrinsic to card design that manufacturers began incorporating it into the artwork. Card makers had to submit their designs to tax authorities, who maintained tight control over production. To prevent counterfeiting, the government became increasingly involved in card manufacturing, eventually creating a state monopoly. The tax endured for over 300 years, funding everything from war efforts to public buildings. When it was finally abolished in the late 20th century, playing card designs had been permanently altered by centuries of tax requirements. The ornate ace of spades in modern decks is a direct descendant of this tax, a ghost of revenue collection past. 6. New York's bagel slicing tax adds a whole new meaning to the phrase, death and taxes. Buy a whole, unsliced bagel in New York, and it's considered an untaxed grocery item. But have that same bagel sliced by the seller, and suddenly it transforms into a prepared food subject to sales tax. This quirky tax distinction means New Yorkers pay about 8 cents more for the convenience of a pre-sliced bagel. The logic? Slicing constitutes food preparation, similar to making a sandwich. Bagel shops have been audited and fined thousands for failing to collect this tax on sliced bagels, while unsliced ones remain tax-free. The rule created absurd situations where customers would buy whole bagels tax-free, then ask for a knife to slice them themselves. It's a quintessential example of how tax codes create bizarre incentives and behavioral changes, all revolving around the humble act of cutting bread. 7. Italy's shadow tax proves that if something exists, someone will find a way to tax it, even if that something is literally nothing. Several Italian municipalities charge businesses for the shadows their awnings, balconies, and signs cast on public property. Tax inspectors measure the square footage of these shadows and levy fees accordingly. The logic seems to be that your shadow is taking up public space that could otherwise be bathed in sunlight. Business owners found themselves in the surreal position of considering the tax implications of shade. Some restaurants redesigned their awnings to cast smaller taxable shadows, while others removed them altogether, leaving diners to bake in the Mediterranean sun. The tax varies by location and time of year, creating the bizarre situation where your tax bill changes with the seasons as shadows lengthen in winter and shorten in summer. Italy essentially found a way to tax the relationship between objects and the sun. 8. Russia's beard. Tax of 1705 remains history's most follicular taxation. Peter the Great, determined to modernize and westernize Russian society, declared war on facial hair by imposing a graduated tax on beards. Nobles, merchants, and commoners paid different rates based on their social status. After paying, men received a copper beard token that had to be carried at all times to prove they'd paid their beard dues. Those caught with unauthorized facial hair faced forcible public shaving by police. The tax served its real purpose, humiliating traditionalists who clung to old Russian customs. The policy created an entire beard token black market and widespread tax evasion through creative facial hair styling. When Catherine the Great abolished the tax in 1772, Russians celebrated by growing their beards with newfound freedom. This bizarre tax illustrates how taxation has been used throughout history, not just to raise revenue, but to forcibly change cultural norms. 9. The UK's television license fee exemplifies how a temporary funding solution can become a permanent institution. British households with television equipment must pay an annual fee of $159 to fund the BBC, regardless of whether they actually watch BBC content. The system employs detection vans that supposedly can detect active TVs in homes, though the technology behind them remains secretive. Evaders face prosecution and fines up to $1,000, with thousands of people, mostly women and low-income individuals, receiving criminal records annually for non-payment. The BBC sends millions of threatening letters each year warning of dire consequences for non-compliance. What started as a simple radio license in the 1920s evolved into one of the world's most unusual media funding systems, essentially creating a mandatory subscription service backed by criminal penalties. Despite numerous reform attempts, the license fee persists, forcing Britons to fund a media organization whether they use it or not. 10. Quebec's maple syrup. Strategic Reserve operates like a cartel disguised as a tax system. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers controls 77% of global maple syrup supply through mandatory membership fees, production quotas, and centralized sales. Producers must send their syrup to the Federation's warehouse, where it's tested, graded, and stored in massive barrels. Producers are paid only when their syrup sells, sometimes waiting years for payment. The system created a black market for bootleg maple syrup and led to one of history's strangest heists in 2012, when thieves stole $18 million worth of syrup from the Strategic Reserve. Small producers who attempt to sell independently face crushing fines and legal action from the Federation. This unique arrangement blurs the line between taxation and market control, effectively taxing producers through mandatory participation in a government-sanctioned monopoly that controls global maple syrup prices. 11. Amsterdam's brothel. Tax exemplifies the strange intersection of vice, regulation, and revenue. Legal sex workers operating in the city's famous red light district must pay an annual tax of $625 per window, on top of income taxes and rental fees. The tax was introduced as part of a larger regulatory framework that simultaneously legitimizes and controls prostitution. Window operators must obtain expensive permits, submit to health inspections, and maintain detailed financial records. The tax created a fascinating legal paradox. The government both taxes and regulates an industry it officially recognizes, while also implementing policies to gradually reduce its visibility and scope. Sex workers argue they face double taxation, paying both business taxes and this special industry tax, while receiving fewer protections than other taxpayers. The window tax effectively created a tiered system where only larger, well-financed operations can afford to comply with all regulations, pushing smaller independent workers into less regulated situations. 12. Japan's Furusato Nozei, hometown tax, transformed charitable giving into tax-advantaged shopping. The program allows Japanese taxpayers to donate money to any municipality in Japan, deduct that amount from their income taxes, and receive local specialty products worth up to 30% of their donation in return. Cities and towns compete fiercely for donations by offering increasingly lavish thank you gifts, from premium steaks and seafood to electronics and travel vouchers. What began as a way to redistribute tax revenue to rural areas became a national tax arbitrage system. Urban taxpayers realized they could redirect their taxes away from Tokyo while receiving valuable goods in return. The program exploded to over $4 billion in annual donations, forcing the government to implement reforms limiting gift values. Economists remain baffled by this system, where taxation, charity, and commerce blur together, effectively allowing citizens to shop with their tax money and receive physical goods in exchange for tax payments. 13. Belgium's barbecue. Tax shows just how specific taxation can get. Several Belgian municipalities require residents to purchase special permits before barbecuing in public spaces or even in private gardens. The fees vary by location, with some towns charging per barbecue event while others sell seasonal permits. Environmental officials justified the tax as necessary to control smoke pollution and fire hazards. Enforcement involves dedicated barbecue patrols that inspect parks and neighborhoods for unauthorized grilling. Violators face substantial fines, often several times the cost of the permit itself. The tax created an underground barbecuing scene, with grill enthusiasts organizing secret cookouts to avoid detection. Local authorities maintain complex regulations dictating permissible grilling hours, acceptable fuel types, and minimum distances from buildings. This peculiar tax reflects how even the most ordinary activities can become subject to government regulation and revenue generation when creative tax authorities decide smoke and sizzle represent untapped tax potential. 14. California's fruit tax initiative attempted to distinguish between healthy fruits and taxable snack fruits in one of the most confusing tax classifications ever devised. The state determined that whole fruits were tax-exempt groceries, but when sold in certain environments, like vending machines, those same fruits became taxable snacks. This created absurd scenarios where, An apple bought at a grocery store was tax-free, but the identical apple purchased from a vending machine incurred sales tax. Vendors faced impenetrable regulations about which fruits qualified for which category. Sliced fruit was taxable unless sold with utensils, in which case it might be exempt. The initiative faced immediate pushback from nutritionists who argued it disincentivized healthy eating, and from retailers overwhelmed by the complexity. After years of confusion and inconsistent enforcement, California was forced to simplify its approach, acknowledging that a tax system that treats the same piece of fruit differently based on where it's sold creates more problems than revenue. 15. Turkey's Istanbul earthquake. Tax demonstrates how temporary crisis taxes have a way of becoming permanent. Following the devastating 1999 Marmara earthquake that killed over 17,000 people, Turkey implemented a special communications tax on phone calls, text messages, and internet usage to fund earthquake preparedness and recovery. The tax was explicitly presented as a short-term measure. 2 decades later, it remains in full effect, despite the original recovery efforts being long completed. The tax has generated billions in revenue, but investigations have revealed much of this money was diverted to general government spending rather than earthquake safety. Citizens who challenge the tax face the uncomfortable position of seemingly opposing disaster preparedness. When subsequent earthquakes struck Turkey, many questioned why the continuous earthquake tax revenue hadn't resulted in better building standards or emergency response. The tax stands as a case study in how crisis-justified taxation often outlives the crisis itself, becoming a permanent revenue stream disconnected from its original purpose. 16. Argentina's check tax shows how desperate governments create desperate tax measures. The country imposes a 1.2% tax on every check transaction, both deposits and withdrawals. Write a check for 100 and you're taxed 100, and you're taxed 100 and you're taxed 1.20. Deposit that same check and the recipient pays another $1.20. Originally implemented as a temporary emergency measure during Argentina's 2001 economic crisis, the tax has been repeatedly extended and now seems permanent. The tax fundamentally altered how Argentines conduct business, with many avoiding the banking system entirely to evade the tax. Cash transactions flourished, creating parallel economies and limiting the government's ability to track financial activity. Businesses pass these costs to consumers through higher prices, effectively creating a hidden sales tax on all goods and services. Despite complaints about its economic distortions and impact on banking adoption, the government remains addicted to the revenue, collecting billions annually from a tax that was never supposed to last more than a few months. 17. Norway's sugar tax has created some of the world's most expensive candy, with taxes adding up to 8 per kilogram to chocolate products. Norway's approach goes beyond typical soda taxes, targeting all products containing added sugar. The tax is so steep that Norwegians regularly make candy runs to neighboring Sweden, creating entire shopping centers along the border dedicated to serving Norwegian sweet tooths. The government justifies the tax as promoting public health, but its origins lie in revenue generation during World War I. The tax creates market distortions, with manufacturers reformulating products specifically for the Norwegian market to avoid the highest tax brackets. Some producers have developed bizarre workarounds, like replacing sugar with fruit concentrates that technically don't count as added sugar, despite having similar health impacts. Despite evidence that the tax disproportionately impacts lower-income households and drives cross-border shopping rather than reducing consumption, Norway maintains some of the world's highest taxation on sweetened products. 18. India's wealth. Tax targeted the super-rich until its abolition in 2015. The tax applied to individuals whose net wealth exceeded specified thresholds, taxing assets including urban land, jewelry, cars, yachts, and other luxury possessions. What made this tax particularly interesting was its strange exemptions. Rural agricultural land was completely exempt, creating a situation where wealthy landowners could avoid the tax entirely by converting holdings to farmland. The tax created an entire industry of wealth tax avoidance consultants who helped clients reclassify assets into exempt categories. Jewelry was often reclassified as religious artifacts to qualify for exemptions. The tax's complex valuation requirements meant that tax authorities and taxpayers frequently engaged in years-long disputes over the worth of unique items. Despite targeting only the wealthiest Indians, compliance rates were notoriously low, with many simply not reporting taxable assets. The government eventually concluded that the tax cost more to administer than it generated in revenue, leading to its replacement with a surcharge on income tax for high earners. 19. Romania's witch tax brought the supernatural economy into the tax system in 2011. The government officially recognized witchcraft as a legal profession, requiring fortune tellers, astrologers, and practitioners of magic to pay income tax on their services. Romania's witches, who hold considerable cultural influence, especially in rural areas, responded with outrage. Some threatened to cast hexes on government officials, while others conducted rituals dumping poisonous mandrake into the Danube River to curse tax collectors. The law required supernatural practitioners to provide receipts to clients and maintain formal bookkeeping, a significant change for a cash-based industry operating in the shadows for centuries. Enforcement proved challenging, as tax authorities struggled to audit cash transactions for services with no objective value. The tax exemplifies the government's attempt to formalize informal economic activities, though many practitioners simply went further underground. The most successful witches embraced the change, using their new legal status to expand services, advertise openly, and even offer corporate consultations, proving that even the occult economy can adapt to taxation. 20. Greece's swimming pool tax employed satellite imagery to catch tax evaders in an unprecedented technological tax enforcement effort. The government used satellite photos to identify undeclared swimming pools, which were subject to substantial luxury taxes. In affluent Athens suburbs, authorities discovered the remarkable discrepancy between 9 officially declared pools and over 6,500 pools visible from space. The tax created an architectural trend of camouflaged pools, with owners installing green or blue tarps to mimic surrounding terrain when viewed from above. Some constructed fake grass coverings that could be rolled over pools when not in use, while others built retractable floors that could conceal pools entirely. The government responded by upgrading to infrared imaging that could detect water bodies regardless of coverings. This cat-and-mouse game between tax, authorities and pool owners exemplifies how taxation drives innovation. Unfortunately, in this case, the innovation was entirely focused on concealment and evasion, rather than productive economic activity. 21. China's chopstick tax exemplifies ecological taxation in action. The government imposed a 5% consumption tax on disposable wooden chopsticks in 2006 to address deforestation concerns. China was consuming an estimated 45 billion pairs of disposable chopsticks annually, requiring the destruction of about 25 million trees. The tax immediately increased prices, forcing restaurants to either absorb the cost, pass it to consumers, or switch to reusable alternatives. The policy created unexpected consequences in the bamboo industry, as manufacturers shifted to faster-growing bamboo to replace hardwoods. The tax sparked a cultural conversation about convenience versus sustainability in a society where disposable chopsticks had become ubiquitous. Enterprising businesses developed washable chopsticks with carrying cases that consumers could bring to restaurants. While some urban restaurants embraced the change, many rural establishments simply absorbed the tax as a cost of doing business, limiting its environmental impact. The chopstick tax represents China's growing use of fiscal policy to address environmental concerns, even when doing so challenges established cultural practices. 22. Spain's solar tax might be the most counterproductive energy policy ever implemented. In 2015, the government imposed fees on individuals who installed solar panels on their homes, requiring them to pay for the electricity they generated for their own use. The policy required solar users to connect to the national grid and pay access charges, even if they weren't drawing power from it. Violations could result in fines up to $60 million. The government claimed the tax was necessary to maintain grid infrastructure, but critics pointed out it was clearly designed to protect conventional utilities from competition. The tax effectively killed Spain's booming solar industry overnight, with new installations dropping by 90%. The policy was particularly baffling given Spain's abundant sunshine and commitment to reducing carbon emissions. After international ridicule and domestic protests, the government repealed most of the tax in 2018, but the damage to Spain's renewable energy sector had already been done. The case demonstrates how taxation can be wielded not just to generate revenue, but to protect established industries from disruptive innovation. 23. Australia's luxury car tax, LCT, adds 33% to vehicles exceeding specified thresholds, currently around AUD 84,916 for most vehicles. The tax was originally implemented to protect Australia's domestic car manufacturing industry, which has since completely disappeared. Despite the disappearance of its original purpose, the tax persists as a significant revenue generator. The policy has created bizarre market distortions, with manufacturers developing stripped-down luxury models specifically priced just below the threshold. Some high-end vehicles are sold in Australia without features that come standard in other markets in order to keep prices below the tax trigger. The tax applies differently to fuel-efficient vehicles, which receive a higher threshold before the tax kicks in. This has created situations where a $100,000 hybrid might avoid the tax while a $90,000 conventional vehicle pays it. This inconsistent application has led to criticism that the tax is less about targeting luxury and more about arbitrary revenue generation. Despite being economically inefficient and no longer serving its original purpose, the luxury car tax remains politically popular, as it is seen as targeting the wealthy. 24. Ireland's plastic bag. Tax demonstrates how small taxes can drive massive behavioral change. In 2002, Ireland introduced a 0.15 tax on plastic shopping bags, a fee that went directly to shoppers rather than being absorbed by retailers. The results were immediate and dramatic. Plastic bag usage dropped by over 90% within weeks. The tax was gradually increased to $0.22 as usage began to creep up again. The revenue was directed to an environmental fund, making it more palatable to the public. The policy transformed shopping culture overnight, with reusable bags quickly becoming a social norm. Prior to the tax, Ireland used 1.2 billion plastic bags annually. After implementation, that number fell to just 230 million. The success inspired similar measures worldwide, with over 40 countries implementing variations of the policy. The tax provided a textbook example of how carefully designed fiscal measures can shift consumer behavior without heavy regulation or outright bans, achieving environmental goals through market mechanisms rather than prohibitions. 25. South Korea's kimchi refrigerator. Tax exemption illustrates how tax policy can reflect cultural values. The government classifies specialized kimchi refrigerators, designed specifically to maintain the perfect temperature and humidity for fermenting the national dish, as necessities rather than luxury appliances. This classification exempts them from several taxes that apply to standard refrigerators, effectively subsidizing their purchase. The policy acknowledges kimchi's central role in Korean cultural identity and diet. These specialized units cost between $1,000 and $1,000 and $1,000 and $500, significantly more than standard refrigerators, but the tax exemption makes them more affordable. The exemption created a booming market for increasingly sophisticated kimchi refrigerators with multiple chambers for different fermentation stages. Manufacturers developed models specifically designed to qualify for the exemption, with features solely dedicated to kimchi preservation. This tax policy demonstrates how governments use taxation not just for revenue, but to preserve cultural practices and traditions, effectively declaring through tax code what aspects of national heritage deserve special protection and promotion. 26. Austria's cow flatulence. Environmental tax proposals sparked international headlines and farmer protests. The government considered taxing livestock methane emissions as part of climate change mitigation efforts, targeting the estimated 95 kilograms of methane each cow produces annually. The proposal would have charged farmers based on herd size, with potential exemptions for organic farming methods. The tax created immediate backlash from Austria's powerful agricultural lobby, who argued it would devastate family farms while having minimal climate impact. Scientists joined the debate, developing feed additives claiming to reduce bovine methane emissions by up to 30%. Some enterprising farmers explored capturing methane for energy generation to offset potential tax liabilities. While the full tax was never implemented, the proposal drove innovation in agricultural methods and raised awareness of livestock's climate impact. The controversy illustrated the challenge of pricing environmental externalities through taxation when doing so affects culturally important industries with strong political representation and public sympathy. 27. Hungary's internet tax proposal of 2014 triggered the largest protests in the country's recent history. The government proposed taxing internet data usage at approximately $0.60 per gigabyte, claiming it would close budget gaps and ensure digital companies paid their fair share. The public immediately recognized the policy for what it was, an attempt to control information flow and penalize internet usage. Within days, over 100,000 protesters took to Budapest streets, many holding glowing phones aloft in a powerful visual statement. The government initially responded by offering to cap the tax at modest levels for individuals, but protesters weren't appeased, recognizing that any tax on data would inevitably increase over time. After weeks of escalating demonstrations, the government completely abandoned the proposal. The episode demonstrated the limits of government power in the digital age, as citizens recognized that taxing a fundamental communication medium represented a threat to free expression and organized with unprecedented speed using the very platform the government sought to tax. 28. New Zealand's Earthquake Commission levy exemplifies risk pooling through taxation. Every New Zealander with home insurance pays a levy of 0.2 per thirty per 0.0 per 100 of coverage, creating a national fund for natural disaster recovery. The system was severely tested by the 2010-2011 Canterbury earthquakes, which caused damages exceeding $40 billion. The levy immediately tripled after these events to rebuild the depleted fund. What makes this tax unique is its direct connection to specific outcomes. Homeowners know exactly what they're paying for and why. The levy created a national conversation about shared risk, with citizens in less earthquake-prone regions essentially subsidizing those in higher-risk areas in exchange for nationwide stability. The system has been studied globally as a model for disaster preparedness. When major earthquakes struck in 2016, the response was significantly more efficient than in previous disasters. This levy demonstrates how taxation can create public goods that markets alone struggle to provide, particularly for low-frequency, high-impact events where typical insurance models may fail due to correlation of risk across an entire region. 29. Mexico's junk food tax, implemented in 2014, represents one of the world's most ambitious attempts to use taxation to fight obesity. The government imposed an 8% tax on high-calorie foods exceeding 275 calories per 100 grams, along with a peso per liter tax on sugary beverages. The policy aimed to address Mexico's diabetes crisis, which had become the nation's leading cause of death. Early studies showed promising results, with soda consumption dropping by 12% in the first year, particularly among lower-income households most vulnerable to obesity-related diseases. The tax created intense pushback from food and beverage giants, who launched advertising campaigns claiming it would harm the economy and eliminate jobs. Implementation proved challenging, as officials struggled to define which foods qualified as junk. Potato chips were taxed, but certain equally caloric traditional Mexican snacks were exempted. The revenue was earmarked for drinking water infrastructure and schools, creating a direct connection between the tax's purpose and its proceeds. This policy represents the growing global trend of using taxation to address public health challenges by directly targeting consumption behavior. 30. Finland's speeding fine. Income-based system applies progressive principles to traffic enforcement. The country calculates traffic violations based on the offender's income, operating on the premise that a $200 fine means nothing to a millionaire, but could be devastating to a minimum wage worker. This has resulted in some extraordinary penalties, including a $54,000 speeding ticket issued to a Nokia executive and a $103,000 fine for a businessman caught driving 65 mph in a 50 mph zone. The system requires violators to submit their most recent tax returns to determine the appropriate fine. Police carry tablet computers with tax database access to calculate preliminary fines on the spot. The policy has created unusual incentives. Some wealthy individuals intentionally arrange their affairs to show minimal income in Finland, while others have learned to slow down specifically on the final days of the month when police typically have quotas to meet. Despite occasional criticism, the system enjoys broad public support as inherently fair, ensuring equal deterrent effect across income levels, rather than making traffic laws effectively optional for the wealthy. 31. Bhutan's tobacco tax and ban represents perhaps the world's strictest anti-smoking regime. The tiny Himalayan kingdom completely banned tobacco sales in 2004 and imposed a 100% customs duty plus additional sales taxes on any tobacco brought into the country for personal consumption. Visitors are limited to 200 cigarettes upon entry, with any excess subject to this punitive taxation. Anyone caught selling tobacco faces imprisonment, while smokers must carry a customs receipt proving they paid the appropriate taxes on their cigarettes. The policy reflects Bhutan's unique gross national happiness approach to governance, which prioritizes well-being over economic metrics. The ban created a substantial black market, with tobacco smuggling from India becoming a significant criminal enterprise. After recognizing the enforcement challenges, Bhutan modified its approach in 2011 to allow limited tobacco imports with proper taxation rather than a complete ban. The case demonstrates the limits of using extreme taxation to eliminate undesired products entirely, as even the most isolated kingdom found that prohibition simply drives markets underground rather than eliminating them. 32. Estonia's digital nomad tax system positions the small Baltic nation at the forefront of taxation in the digital age. The country offers a special e-residency program, allowing remote workers and digital entrepreneurs to establish Estonian businesses and pay taxes there while working from anywhere in the world. The system provides a simplified tax structure with a flat 20% corporate tax that's only applied to distributed profits, not revenue. The program launched in 2014 and has attracted over 80,000 digital nomads from 170 countries. The tax creates unique situations where individuals may never set foot in Estonia, yet maintain their primary tax relationship with the country. Estonia's innovation comes from recognizing that in a digital economy, physical presence is increasingly irrelevant to economic activity. The system has forced other nations to reconsider their own approach to taxing remote work. Rather than fighting the trend toward borderless digital work, Estonia embraced it, turning what most countries view as a tax enforcement challenge into a competitive advantage and revenue opportunity. 33. Malta's yacht registration. Tax benefits have transformed the tiny Mediterranean island into a maritime financial center. The country offers substantial tax advantages for yacht registration, including reduced VAT rates as low as 5.4% compared to standard European rates of around 20%. Malta's system uses a formula based on yacht size and type to calculate a reduced effective use period, assuming larger yachts spend less time in European waters. This creates the unusual situation where a 24-meter yacht might pay VAT on only 30% of its value. The policy attracted billions in luxury yacht registrations, with Malta's flag now flying over many of the world's most expensive private vessels. The tax scheme created controversy within the European Union, with other member states arguing it constitutes harmful tax competition. It also developed a specialized legal industry in Malta, focused exclusively on yacht registration and tax optimization. The benefits primarily help the ultra-wealthy, raising questions about tax equity. Yet the small nation defends the policy as critical to its maritime service economy and international competitiveness. 34. Cyprus's bank deposit levy of 2013 stands as perhaps the most shocking tax in modern financial history. When Cyprus's banking system collapsed under the weight of bad investments, the government faced a terrible choice: let the banks fail or seize depositors' money. In an unprecedented move, they announced plans to tax all bank accounts, 6.75% on deposits under $100,000, and 9.9% on larger accounts. Citizens woke up one March morning to find ATMs disabled and their savings suddenly inaccessible. The panicked public besieged bank branches while Parliament scrambled to revise the plan. After intense international pressure, small depositors were spared, but those with over $100,000 lost up to 40% of their funds, converted to worthless bank shares. The levy fundamentally transformed banking throughout Europe, shattering the assumption that deposits were sacrosanct. New EU banking regulations emerged, creating clear hierarchies of who pays when banks fail. The Cyprus tax remains the financial equivalent of a horror story, a cautionary tale of how quickly governments can convert private savings into public revenue. 35. Sweden's microwave tax proposal shows how far environmental taxation might go in the future. The government considered taxing household microwaves based on their electromagnetic radiation levels and energy consumption. The reasoning was twofold: discourage potentially harmful radiation and promote more energy-efficient appliances. The proposal created immediate division among scientists, with some supporting the precautionary principle while others dismissed radiation concerns as unfounded. Appliance manufacturers lobbied aggressively against the tax, arguing it would disproportionately impact low-income households who rely on microwaves as their primary cooking method. Though never fully implemented, the proposal sparked a national conversation about the invisible environmental impacts of everyday devices. Sweden eventually opted for a broader approach, focusing on energy efficiency ratings rather than singling out specific appliances. The case illustrates the expanding frontier of environmental taxation as governments search for new ways to internalize previously ignored externalities, even ones invisible to the naked eye. 36. Luxembourg's digital services. Tax targets tech giants in a country otherwise known for tax leniency. In 2021, the tiny European nation implemented a 3% levy on revenues from digital advertising, data sales, and platform services for companies with global revenues exceeding $750 million. What makes this tax remarkable is the irony. Luxembourg has long served as a tax haven for many of the same companies it now taxes. The tax created diplomatic tensions, particularly with the United States, home to many affected tech companies. Implementation required sophisticated tracking of digital service delivery within Luxembourg's borders, creating new compliance burdens. Tech companies responded by restructuring European operations to minimize exposure. The tax represents Luxembourg's attempt to balance competing pressures, maintaining its reputation as a business-friendly jurisdiction while responding to growing international criticism of tax avoidance by digital multinationals. The resulting policy walks a careful line, applying just enough taxation to deflect criticism without fundamentally altering Luxembourg's attractiveness as a corporate headquarters location. 37. Iceland's volcanic ash. Tax exemption demonstrates how tax systems adapt to unique local conditions. Following the 2010 eruption that famously disrupted European air travel, Iceland implemented special tax provisions for businesses affected by volcanic activity. Companies can deduct ash cleanup costs, claim accelerated depreciation on damaged equipment, and receive temporary tax holidays during recovery periods. The exemption recognizes the unique challenge of operating businesses in a country with 32 active volcanic systems. What began as an emergency response evolved into a permanent feature of Iceland's tax code, with provisions regularly activated during subsequent eruptions. The policy acknowledges that, in some locations, natural disasters aren't exceptional events but predictable business risks. Rather than providing direct subsidies, Iceland uses the tax code to share these costs across society. The approach has encouraged businesses to develop volcanic contingency plans and resilience measures, knowing they'll receive tax relief rather than complete bailouts. This clever use of tax policy helps maintain economic activity in areas that might otherwise be considered too risky for investment. 38. Monaco's zero-income tax policy is the ultimate tax haven feature that has shaped the tiny principality into what it is today. Since 1869, residents have paid no personal income tax whatsoever. a policy that has attracted wealthy individuals from around the world. The tax exemption comes with a catch. You must actually live in Monaco for at least 6 months each year, and French citizens are excluded due to special treaties. The policy transformed Monaco from a sleepy Mediterranean town into one of the world's most expensive real estate markets, with average apartment prices exceeding $60,000 per square meter. The government funds itself through other means: a 33% tax on company profits, a 20% VAT on goods and services, and substantial revenues from the famous Monte Carlo casino. The zero-tax policy created a socio-economic monoculture, with nearly one-third of residents being millionaires. While criticized as a tax haven, Monaco defends its system as the legitimate exercise of tax sovereignty by a micro-state with limited natural resources and economic options. 39. Singapore's car ownership certificate system has created the world's most expensive place to own a vehicle. Anyone wishing to buy a car must first purchase a Certificate of Entitlement, COE, through a competitive bidding process. These certificates, valid for just 10 years, routinely cost more than the vehicles themselves, often exceeding $50,000 for standard cars. The system was implemented in 1990 to control traffic congestion on the small island nation by limiting the number of new vehicle registrations each year. The policy has created an extraordinary situation where a Toyota Corolla that costs around $20,000 in the United States sells for over $100,000 in Singapore, after taxes and the COE. Wealthy residents navigate the system by purchasing luxury vehicles, reasoning that if you're already paying $50,000 just for permission to own a car, you might as well buy an expensive one. The policy has successfully limited vehicle growth to about 0.25% annually and generated billions in government revenue. But critics argue that it has turned car ownership into a luxury reserved exclusively for the wealthy, deepening inequality in one of the most economically stratified societies in the developed world. 40. Vatican City's museum entry tax turns tourism into a primary revenue source for the world's smallest sovereign state. While officially classified as entry fees rather than taxes, these charges function identically to tourism taxes found elsewhere. The Vatican museums charge up to $70 per visitor, generating over $100 million annually, a substantial portion of Vatican City's revenue. What makes this system unique is how a religious entity uses essentially secular tourism to fund spiritual activities. The revenue pays for art preservation, building maintenance, and supports the Holy See's global religious operations. The system creates ethical questions about accessibility, with critics arguing that important religious and cultural heritage should be more freely available. In response, the Vatican offers reduced fees for students and free entry on certain days, essentially creating a progressive taxation system based on ability to pay. This tax fee system reflects the Vatican's unusual dual nature as both religious institution and sovereign state, using the tools of government, taxation, to support activities typically funded through voluntary donations in other religious contexts. 41. Brazil's tax on financial transactions, IOF, reaches into nearly every movement of money in South America's largest economy. The tax applies to foreign exchange, loans, insurance, and securities transactions at rates varying from 4.38% to a whopping 25% for certain currency operations. Originally implemented as a temporary measure in 1993, the tax has become a permanent feature of Brazil's financial landscape. The IOF structure creates bizarre incentives. Short-term loans face higher rates than longer ones, regardless of risk. Foreign currency purchases for travel are taxed differently depending on whether you use cash or credit cards. The tax significantly increases the cost of capital throughout the Brazilian economy while generating substantial revenue. Financial institutions have developed elaborate structures to minimize IOF impact, creating an entire industry of tax optimization specialists. Critics argue the tax reduces Brazil's international competitiveness and financial market efficiency, while defenders point to its effectiveness at generating revenue from financial activities that might otherwise escape taxation. This complex tax exemplifies how revenue needs often trump economic efficiency in developing economies with limited tax enforcement capabilities. 42. Portugal's IMI property tax has evolved into an anti-speculation weapon in the housing market. The municipal property tax includes surcharges for vacant properties, with rates reaching 7 cents annually for luxury homes valued above $1 million that remain empty. Standard rates range from 0.3% to 0.45%, but vacant properties can face triple these amounts. The tax was redesigned following Portugal's 2010-2014 economic crisis, when foreign investors began purchasing properties in Lisbon and Porto solely as investments, leaving them empty while locals struggled to find affordable housing. The progressive structure means modest family homes face minimal taxation, while luxury properties and vacant investments bear a heavier burden. The system created significant behavioral changes in the property market, with owners either placing vacant homes on the rental market or selling them, rather than paying punitive tax rates. Property management companies now offer vacancy avoidance services, ensuring homes show sufficient occupancy to avoid the higher rates. This innovative use of property taxation addresses housing affordability without direct rent controls, using tax incentives to change investor behavior. 43. Chile's green tax targets. Large thermoelectric power plants as part of the country's climate change strategy. Implemented in 2017, the tax charges $5 per megawatt hour for facilities exceeding 50 megawatt capacity, adding costs specifically designed to account for environmental externalities not reflected in market prices. The tax created immediate changes in Chile's electricity generation mix, with some older coal plants becoming economically unviable when the environmental tax was added to their operating costs. Energy companies responded by accelerating investments in renewable projects, particularly solar, installations in the Atacama Desert, which offers some of the world's highest solar radiation. The tax's straightforward design, linking payments directly to emissions rather than complex regulatory requirements, provided clear market signals while allowing companies flexibility in how they respond. Revenue is directed toward environmental protection and community development in areas affected by power plant pollution. The Chilean approach has been studied by other developing nations, seeking to reduce emissions without imposing rigid regulations that might hamper economic growth, demonstrating how well-designed taxation can harness market forces to achieve environmental goals. 44. Thailand's durian export. Tax protects domestic access to the divisive king of fruits that foreigners either love or hate. The government imposes variable export duties on fresh durian to ensure adequate domestic supply before permitting international sales. The tax reflects the fruit's unique cultural importance in Thailand, where durian season is celebrated with festivals and special markets. The policy was implemented after Chinese demand for premium durian varieties like Monthong and Kanyao drove local prices beyond the reach of ordinary Thai consumers. During peak season, export taxes might be minimal, but they increase sharply when domestic supplies run low. The system created a thriving durian smuggling industry along the Thai-Chinese border, with traffickers moving tons of untaxed fruit. It also drove innovation in durian preservation techniques, as processed durian faces lower export taxes than fresh fruit. Thailand's approach demonstrates how agricultural taxation can serve cultural preservation goals beyond simple revenue generation. By keeping some durian varieties affordable domestically through export taxation, Thailand ensures this culturally significant food remains accessible to its citizens while still benefiting from lucrative international markets. 45. Kenya's digital service tax brings the gig economy under taxation in an innovative approach to expanding the tax base. Implemented in 2021, the 1.5% tax on gross transaction value applies to all digital services provided by non-resident entities, from Netflix subscriptions to Uber rides and online advertising. The tax represents Kenya's attempt to capture revenue from multinational digital giants operating in its economy without physical presence. Implementation faced significant challenges, as tax authorities struggled to identify transactions occurring through foreign payment processors and digital platforms. Some companies absorbed the tax, while others passed it directly to Kenyan consumers through higher prices. The policy sparked debate about digital sovereignty and whether developing nations can effectively tax global tech companies without international cooperation. Kenya's approach has been closely watched by other African nations seeking to increase tax revenue from digital activities that typically escape traditional taxation. The tax highlights how digital commerce is forcing tax systems worldwide to evolve beyond physical presence requirements, creating new definitions of where economic activity occurs and which government has the right to tax it. 46. Saudi Arabia's value. Added tax introduction in 2018 marked a fundamental shift in the social contract between citizens and government in the oil-rich kingdom. For decades, Saudi Arabia provided generous benefits without taxation, following the principle of no taxation, no representation. The introduction of a 5% VAT, later tripled to 15% during the COVID-19 pandemic, signaled the beginning of a new era. The tax was implemented as part of Vision 2030, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's plan to diversify the economy away from oil dependency. The sudden tax increase created immediate inflation, particularly painful during a pandemic. Induced economic slowdown. Implementation required building a tax administration system essentially from scratch, with businesses struggling to comply with unfamiliar requirements. The policy raised questions about the monarchy's future relationship with citizens, as taxation historically correlates with demands for greater political representation. Saudi officials have carefully framed the tax as necessary for economic transformation rather than a permanent feature of life, while simultaneously expanding the kingdom's sovereign wealth fund as an alternative to tax-funded services. This case illustrates how taxation often signals deeper shifts in governance beyond simple revenue generation. 47. Pakistan's withholding tax on mobile cards creates an unusual link between telecommunications and tax compliance. When Pakistanis purchase prepaid mobile credit, a withholding tax is automatically deducted, with registered taxpayers eligible for refunds while non-filers pay the full amount. The system effectively uses mobile phone usage as a means to identify potential taxpayers in a country where less than 1% of the population files income tax returns. The tax created controversy over its regressive nature, as it applies equally to all users regardless of income. Implementation generated immediate behavioral changes, with consumers purchasing smaller denominations more frequently to minimize one-time tax impacts. The policy sparked several legal challenges, with courts temporarily suspending collection before ultimately upholding a modified version. Pakistan's approach represents an innovative solution to the challenge of expanding the tax base in developing economies with large informal sectors and limited administrative capacity. By piggybacking on the nearly universal adoption of mobile phones, tax authorities gained access to millions of potential taxpayers who had previously operated entirely outside the formal economy, creating pathways to broader tax compliance through a service virtually everyone uses. 48. Croatia's tourist tax, sojourn tax, funds tourism infrastructure through direct visitor contributions. Visitors staying in Croatian accommodation pay between $0.50 and $1.50 per person per night, depending on season and location. The tax allocates 65% of revenue to local tourist boards, 25% to municipalities, and 10% to the National Tourist Board, creating a direct link between tourism impacts and funding for visitor services. The system creates interesting seasonal variations, with summer rates in popular coastal destinations significantly higher than winter rates in less visited areas. Implementation required sophisticated coordination between accommodation providers, who must register guests with tax authorities within 24 hours of arrival. Digital platforms like Airbnb initially resisted collection responsibility but eventually integrated the tax into their booking systems after regulatory pressure. The tax has enabled significant tourism infrastructure improvements while keeping other taxes lower for permanent residents, effectively having visitors pay directly for the additional public services they require. This approach has been studied by other tourism-dependent economies seeking to balance the economic benefits of visitors with their impacts on local infrastructure and environment. 49. Algeria's tax on luxury vehicles imposes progressive taxation based on engine displacement and vehicle age. Cars with engines exceeding 2,000 cc face import duties and taxes that can reach 60% of vehicle value, effectively doubling the cost compared to smaller vehicles. The tax system was designed with dual purposes, generating revenue while protecting the domestic automobile assembly industry that focuses on smaller, more affordable models. Implementation created a thriving gray market in vehicle importation, with elaborate schemes to misclassify vehicles or import them disassembled to avoid the highest tax rates. Wealthy Algerians responded by keeping luxury vehicles registered in neighboring countries or maintaining older high-end cars rather than purchasing new ones. The tax created distinct class signaling through vehicle choice, with large SUVs and luxury sedans becoming explicit displays of wealth due to their tax-inflated prices. Despite criticism that the tax limits consumer choice and creates market distortions, the government has maintained it as part of broader economic nationalism policies aimed at reducing imports and encouraging domestic manufacturing, demonstrating how taxation often serves multiple policy objectives beyond simple revenue generation. 50. Morocco's solidarity. Tax on luxury represents tax policy as explicit wealth redistribution. The tax applies to items including high-end vehicles, yachts, private aircraft, and jewelry, with proceeds specifically directed towards social development programs and poverty reduction. The system operates parallel to regular VAT, creating a two-tier consumption tax where luxury goods face significantly higher rates. The tax was introduced following the Arab Spring uprisings as part of broader reforms to address social inequality. Implementation required creating specific luxury product categories and valuation systems, with tax authorities struggling to assess unique items like art and antiques. Wealthy Moroccans developed various avoidance strategies, from purchasing luxury goods abroad to creating complex ownership structures for high-value assets. Despite these challenges, the explicit linking of luxury consumption with social welfare funding created broader political support for the tax than might otherwise exist for such targeted measures. Morocco's approach demonstrates how framing taxation in terms of social solidarity rather than simple revenue generation can increase public acceptance, particularly when the revenue has a clear, visible purpose that addresses recognized social needs. 51. The UAE's excise tax on harmful products shattered the long-standing perception of the Gulf as a tax-free haven. In 2017, the United Arab Emirates introduced excise taxes of 100% on tobacco and energy drinks, and 50% on carbonated beverages, explicitly labeling them sin taxes, to discourage consumption of unhealthy products. The introduction of taxation in a country that had long marketed itself as tax-free created immediate behavioral changes, with soda consumption dropping by 30% in the first few months. Implementation required building tax administration systems from scratch, with many businesses struggling with compliance requirements. The policy created interesting border effects with neighboring Oman, which implemented similar taxes months later to prevent cross-border shopping. The UAE carefully marketed these taxes as being fundamentally different from income or sales taxes, focusing on their public health benefits rather than revenue generation. This targeted approach allowed the government to maintain its broadly tax-friendly image while selectively applying taxation to specific products. The case illustrates how even the most tax-resistant jurisdictions eventually find certain economic activities they're willing to tax, typically starting with products that can be characterized as harmful or luxurious. 52. Colombia's wealth. Tax represents taxation as economic emergency response. The government periodically implements temporary wealth taxes on individuals and businesses with net worth exceeding specific thresholds, most recently during the COVID-19 pandemic. These taxes are explicitly framed as extraordinary measures for extraordinary times, ways to generate revenue quickly during crises. The tax creates intense capital flight pressure, with wealthy Colombians shifting assets offshore before implementation dates. Complex valuation rules lead to disputes between taxpayers and authorities, particularly for privately held businesses and real estate. Each iteration of the tax comes with promises that it will truly be temporary, Yet the pattern of re-implementation during successive crises has created a perception that wealth taxes are becoming a permanent feature of Colombia's tax landscape. The approach demonstrates the political challenges of taxing wealth directly, with governments finding it easier to justify such measures during widely acknowledged emergencies than as ongoing policy. Colombia's experience highlights how crisis taxation often opens doors to revenue sources that would face insurmountable political resistance during normal times, creating precedents that facilitate future taxation even after the original emergency has passed. 53. Peru's departure. Tax exemplifies how tourism creates unique taxation opportunities. International travelers leaving Peru by air must pay approximately $31, typically embedded in ticket prices but sometimes collected separately at airports. The tax applies regardless of visit duration or purpose, creating a straightforward revenue stream from non-residents. The tax has expanded over time, with additional airport improvement fees and security charges effectively creating multiple layers of departure taxation. Implementation required coordination with airlines, who initially resisted collection responsibility before eventually integrating the charges into their ticketing systems. The policy created unusual economic distortions along Peru's borders, where some travelers choose land crossings specifically to avoid the air departure tax. The tax remains controversial among tourism industry stakeholders, who argue it makes Peru less competitive with neighboring destinations. Despite these concerns, the political attractiveness of taxing non-voting foreigners rather than domestic constituencies ensures the tax persists and gradually increases over time. Peru's approach demonstrates the enduring appeal of tourist taxation. It generates significant revenue with minimal political cost, since those bearing the burden have no voice in the political process that establishes the tax. 54. The Philippines documentary. Stamp tax turns legal formality into government revenue. The tax applies to virtually all legal documents, from marriage certificates to stock transfers and loan agreements, with rates ranging from nominal fixed amounts to percentages based on transaction value. The system, originally implemented during the American colonial period, creates an unusual incentive structure where parties sometimes avoid documenting transactions specifically to evade the tax. Implementation relies heavily on self-reporting, with audits focusing on financial institutions and large corporations where paper trails are more extensive. The tax created an underground market in counterfeit documentary stamps, prompting the government to implement security features similar to those used in currency. Recent digitization efforts have transformed the physical stamps into electronic payments, though the underlying tax structure remains largely unchanged. The Philippines' approach represents one of the world's most comprehensive attempts to tax the formalization of legal relationships and transactions, capturing revenue at the moment parties seek legal recognition or protection for their agreements. This creates an implicit choice between taxation and informal arrangements, effectively taxing the value of legal certainty itself. 55. Bangladesh's advance income. Tax on imports functions as a forced tax prepayment system. Importers must pay income tax in advance based on shipment value, with rates varying by product category and importer classification. The tax creates significant cash flow challenges for businesses, as they must pay tax on presumed profits before goods are sold or revenue generated. Implementation relies on customs officials at ports of entry, creating opportunities for negotiation and corruption in valuation determinations. The system essentially uses import activity as a proxy for future taxable income, assuming imported goods will generate specific profit margins. This approach addresses the challenge of income tax enforcement in an economy with limited administrative capacity and widespread tax avoidance. Critics argue the system unfairly burdens legitimate businesses while allowing domestic producers to delay tax payments until after sales. Bangladesh's approach demonstrates how developing economies often prioritize collection certainty over theoretical tax equity, accepting economically distortionary practices that guarantee revenue rather than more sophisticated systems that might be easier to evade. The resulting policy may be economically inefficient, but succeeds in its primary goal of ensuring tax payment from businesses that might otherwise report minimal taxable income. 56. Sri Lanka's nation-building tax represented taxation as patriotic duty during post-war Reconstruction. Implemented after the end of the Civil War in 2009, the tax applied a 2% charge on a wide range of economic activities, with proceeds ostensibly dedicated to rebuilding infrastructure in conflict-affected regions. The tax's name explicitly framed payment as participation in national development rather than simple revenue generation. Implementation created complexity as the tax applied alongside existing VAT and other consumption taxes, creating multiple layers of taxation on the same transactions. Businesses struggled with compliance requirements, particularly as the tax base expanded over time to include additional economic activities. Despite its national reconstruction branding, investigations revealed much of the revenue was diverted to general government expenditures rather than specific rebuilding projects. The tax was eventually abolished in 2020 and replaced with other revenue measures, though many of its features were simply incorporated into the standard VAT system. Sri Lanka's experience demonstrates how governments use patriotic framing to increase acceptance of new taxes, linking payment to widely supported national goals rather than abstract revenue needs, even when the actual revenue usage might not match the stated purpose. 57. Nigeria's technology. Tax Initiative reveals the challenges of taxing the digital economy in developing nations. The government has proposed various technology-related taxes, including levies on electronic transactions, social media usage, and digital services, though implementation remains inconsistent. The tax proposals reflect Nigeria's attempt to capture revenue from the rapidly growing digital sector that largely escapes traditional taxation methods. Implementation faces significant obstacles, including limited technical capacity to monitor digital transactions and strong resistance from Nigeria's growing technology startup ecosystem. Early attempts created immediate behavioral changes, with users adopting VPNs and alternative payment methods to circumvent monitored channels. The proposals sparked nationwide debates about digital inclusion, with critics arguing that taxing basic connectivity would widen the digital divide in a country where internet access remains limited. Nigeria's experience highlights the tension between revenue needs and digital development goals in emerging economies, where governments must balance the attraction of untapped tax potential against the risk of hampering digital adoption through premature or excessive taxation. The resulting policies often reflect uncomfortable compromises, attempting to generate revenue without significantly impeding digital growth. 58. Ghana's electronic transaction levy demonstrates the political risks of taxing digital payments. Implemented in 2022, the 1.5% tax applies to mobile money transfers, bank transfers, and merchant payments exceeding 100 Ghana cedis daily. The tax sparked immediate public backlash, with transaction volumes dropping by over 40% in the first month as users returned to cash. Implementation required significant technical development to integrate tax collection into multiple payment platforms, with several delays and exemption adjustments as problems emerged. The policy created a direct disincentive to Ghana's previously successful financial inclusion efforts, reversing years of progress in transitioning from cash to digital payments. Physical fighting broke out in Parliament during debates over the tax, underscoring its political sensitivity. Despite widespread opposition, the government pressed forward, arguing the revenue was essential for debt reduction and economic stability. Ghana's experience reveals how taxation of everyday financial activities can trigger stronger public resistance than traditional taxes, particularly when they affect recently adopted behaviors that haven't yet become fully entrenched. The case illustrates the delicate balance required when taxing emerging sectors, where excessive or premature taxation can fundamentally alter development trajectories. 59. Egypt's entertainment tax turns leisure into a revenue source for a cash-strapped government. The tax applies variable rates to recreational activities, with cinema tickets taxed at 5 to 24%, concerts at 5 to 20%, and sporting events at 5 to 15%, depending on venue type and ticket price categories. The system creates unusual market distortions, with some entertainment venues reconfiguring seating or adjusting price structures to qualify for lower tax brackets. Implementation requires venue operators to use government-approved ticketing systems that automatically calculate and remit taxes, creating monitoring challenges for informal entertainment. The tax disproportionately impacts middle-class urban residents, who are the primary consumers of formal entertainment subject to the tax. Egypt's approach represents a common pattern in developing economies, where governments target discretionary spending for taxation while leaving necessities untaxed. The policy reflects the political calculation that citizens are more likely to accept taxes on optional activities than on basic needs, even when the economic distinction between necessity and luxury becomes increasingly blurred. This entertainment tax serves both revenue generation and subtle social engineering purposes, steering consumption away from activities the government considers less productive. 60. Jordan's special tax on bank profits reflects taxation as crisis response in Middle Eastern economies. During periods of economic challenge, Jordan imposes additional taxes on financial institutions, with rates reaching 20% above standard corporate taxes. The tax is justified based on the banking sector's consistently higher profitability compared to other industries, particularly during economic downturns when banks maintain earnings while other sectors struggle. Implementation creates tension between the government's revenue needs and its simultaneous efforts to expand financial inclusion and credit availability. Banks typically respond by increasing fees and lending spreads, effectively passing much of the tax burden to customers. The policy creates interesting behavioral changes in how banks recognize and time profit realization, with many developing sophisticated tax planning strategies to shift earnings recognition to lower tax periods. Jordan's approach exemplifies how governments often target financial institutions for special taxation during crises, based on both their ability to pay and their perceived responsibility for economic challenges. The resulting system creates a counter-cyclical taxation pattern where bank tax rates increase during economic downturns precisely when government revenue needs are greatest, though the economic efficiency of such targeted sectoral taxation remains debated. 61. Tunisia's development tax exemplifies taxation as regional economic policy. The government imposes various development taxes on businesses and imports, with proceeds directed toward infrastructure projects in underdeveloped interior regions. The system creates a direct transfer mechanism from economically advantaged coastal areas to historically neglected inland provinces. Implementation involves complex regional classification systems, with tax rates varying based on development indices for different areas. The policy sparked debates about tax equity versus economic efficiency, with businesses arguing that development would be better served by lower overall taxation rather than redistributive schemes. The tax creates location incentives, with some businesses establishing nominal headquarters in development zones to qualify for tax benefits while maintaining actual operations elsewhere. Tunisia's approach represents an attempt to use tax policy to address regional inequality, a persistent challenge in countries where economic activity tends to concentrate in specific geographic areas. The development tax essentially serves as a mandatory internal foreign aid program, forcing economic actors in prosperous regions to subsidize development in poorer ones. This approach reflects the political reality that direct budget transfers to underdeveloped regions often face stronger resistance than dedicated taxes with specific geographic allocations. 62. Lebanon's built property. Tax illustrates how political dysfunction undermines even basic taxation. The country imposes taxes on built properties based on rental value assessments, though collection has been severely compromised by Lebanon's ongoing economic and political crises. The system theoretically applies progressive rates based on property value and location, but implementation has become increasingly arbitrary due to the collapse of normal administrative functions. The tax created bizarre situations during Lebanon's hyperinflation, as property values in Lebanese pounds skyrocketed while tax payments became essentially worthless due to currency depreciation. Implementation relies on municipal governments with limited capacity, creating significant regional variations in enforcement. Property owners developed various avoidance strategies, from bribing assessors to deliberately leaving properties in unfinished states to qualify for construction exemptions. Lebanon's experience demonstrates how even well-designed tax systems ultimately depend on functioning government administration. When basic governance collapses, tax collection becomes ad hoc and inequitable, regardless of the underlying policy design. The resulting situation undermines tax morale, as citizens observe arbitrary enforcement and question why they should comply when others don't, creating a downward spiral of non-compliance that further erodes government capacity. 63. Ethiopia's turnover. Tax for small businesses represents simplified taxation for administrative efficiency. Businesses with annual revenues below specified thresholds pay taxes based on gross turnover rather than profit, with rates varying between 2 to 10% depending on business type. The system acknowledges the reality that many small businesses in developing economies lack capacity for complex accounting required by profit-based taxation. Implementation relies heavily on presumptive assessment, with tax officials estimating likely turnover based on visible business characteristics. The tax creates interesting threshold effects, with some businesses deliberately limiting growth to remain below turnover tax thresholds and avoid more complex standard taxation. Ethiopia's approach represents a pragmatic compromise between tax coverage and administrative capacity, accepting some theoretical unfairness in taxing revenue, rather than profit, in exchange for bringing more businesses into the tax system with manageable compliance requirements. This simplified approach has been adopted by many developing nations facing similar challenges of limited administrative capacity and widespread informality. The resulting system sacrifices some economic efficiency and horizontal equity, but succeeds in expanding the tax base to include businesses that would likely escape taxation entirely under more complex systems requiring sophisticated record-keeping. 64. Tanzania's service levy links business taxation directly to workforce development. The government imposes levies on various professional and commercial services, with proceeds supporting skills training programs. The tax operates as a percentage of service fees, creating a direct connection between economic activity in skilled service sectors and funding for developing the next generation of skilled workers. Implementation requires service providers to self-assess and remit the levy, creating significant compliance challenges in sectors with limited formal record-keeping. The policy created interesting incentives around service classification, with businesses attempting to reclassify activities to minimize levy exposure. Tanzania's approach represents an innovative attempt to address the common developing economy challenge of skills mismatch, using taxation to create a sustainable funding mechanism for vocational training rather than relying on general revenue or donor support. The direct connection between the taxed activity and the funded outcome increases political acceptability, as businesses can more easily accept taxation when they see clear benefits for their sector. This approach has been studied by other developing nations seeking sustainable funding for skills development outside general budget allocations, which tend to prioritize immediate needs over long-term workforce development. 65. Uganda's over-the-top services tax represents perhaps the world's most controversial attempt to tax social media. Implemented in 2018, the tax required users to pay approximately $0.05 daily to access platforms including Facebook, WhatsApp, and Twitter. The tax created immediate, public outrage and widespread tax avoidance through VPN usage. Implementation required coordination with telecommunications companies, who added tax collection responsibilities to their existing operations. The policy reduced social media usage by nearly 30%, disproportionately affecting lower-income users. Government officials initially justified the tax as necessary to reduce gossip on social media, before later emphasizing revenue generation as the primary purpose. The tax sparked nationwide protests, with opponents arguing it restricted free expression and digital inclusion. After years of controversy and disappointing revenue collection, the government replaced it with a broader tax on internet data in 2021. Uganda's experience demonstrates the political risks of directly taxing popular digital services, particularly when the tax is easily avoidable through readily available technological workarounds. The case illustrates how digital taxation attempts often produce unintended consequences that undermine both revenue goals and broader digital development objectives. 66. Rwanda's plastic bag. Ban tax policy represents taxation as environmental behavior modification. Rather than simply banning plastic bags, Rwanda implemented prohibitive import duties and sales taxes that made single-use plastic bags economically non-viable. The system created immediate changes in consumer and retailer behavior, with paper, cloth, and banana leaf alternatives quickly replacing plastic bags. Implementation included both tax incentives for alternatives and severe penalties for continued plastic bag usage, including fines and potential imprisonment for smugglers. The policy transformed Rwanda's landscape, eliminating the plastic bag litter common in neighboring countries and earning Rwanda recognition as one of Africa's cleanest nations. This hybrid approach, using taxation to effectively implement a ban while technically keeping the product legal, provided greater flexibility than an outright prohibition. Rwanda's experience demonstrates how well-designed taxation can change deeply ingrained consumer behaviors more effectively than direct regulation alone, particularly when combined with complementary policies supporting alternatives. The resulting transformation has been so successful that many visitors to Rwanda are unaware that the change was driven primarily through tax policy rather than direct prohibition, illustrating how taxation can shape behavior so completely that the tax itself becomes invisible. 67. Zimbabwe's AIDS levy stands as taxation with moral purpose. Since 1999, the government has imposed a 3% surcharge on all income tax payments, with proceeds dedicated exclusively to HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment programs. The levy emerged during Zimbabwe's devastating AIDS epidemic when approximately 25% of adults were HIV positive and represents one of the world's most direct attempts to address a public health crisis through dedicated taxation. The system creates an unusual funding stability for AIDS programs, insulating them somewhat from political budget battles and donor funding fluctuations. Implementation integrates directly with existing income tax collection, minimizing administrative costs. The levy survived even through Zimbabwe's period of hyperinflation and economic collapse, demonstrating the remarkable resilience of dedicated taxes with strong moral justification. Public acceptance remains high despite Zimbabwe's otherwise controversial tax system, as citizens recognize the direct connection between the levy and visible health services. This approach has been studied by other nations facing specific health challenges, as it demonstrates how taxation explicitly linked to addressing widely acknowledged crises can achieve political sustainability that might be impossible for general revenue measures. The AIDS levy's endurance through multiple regime changes and economic catastrophes testifies to the power of moral purpose in taxation. 101 Weirdest Tax Rules from Around the World. 68. Zambia's mineral royalty tax created what mining executives call the copper roller coaster. The government taxes mining companies based on a sliding scale tied to global copper prices. When prices rise, tax rates can jump from 5.5% to a staggering 20% overnight. This system was implemented after decades of foreign mining companies extracting Zambia's mineral wealth while paying minimal taxes. The government argued that its people deserved to share in windfall profits when copper prices soared. Mining giants responded by threatening mass layoffs and investment freezes. In practice, the tax created a bizarre situation where mining companies might actively hope for lower copper prices to avoid higher tax brackets. After years of tense negotiations and multiple policy reversals, Zambia settled on a compromise system that maintained the sliding scale, but with more gradual transitions. The case exemplifies the delicate balance resource-rich developing nations face: extract enough revenue from their natural wealth without driving away the very companies with the expertise to extract it. When geology meets taxation, neither side escapes unchanged. 69. Botswana's alcohol levy might be the world's most ambitious attempt to legislate sobriety through taxation. Implemented in 2008 at 30%, the tax has steadily increased to over 70% on spirits, effectively doubling retail prices. The policy was personally championed by then-President Ian Khama, a teetotaler deeply concerned about alcohol's social impact. Local breweries initially reeled from the shock, with sales plummeting and widespread smuggling of South African alcohol ensuing. The tax created a fascinating natural experiment in behavioral economics. Would Botswanans drink less or simply spend more of their income on alcohol? The answer was complicated. Official alcohol sales decreased, but underground brewing of potentially dangerous traditional beers increased. After a decade, the government quietly began reducing the levy, acknowledging that taxation alone couldn't solve deep-seated social problems. What began as a moral crusade ended as a pragmatic compromise, revealing the limits of using tax policy to engineer social behavior. Sometimes human thirst simply finds a way around tax barriers. 70. Namibia's Regional Services Councils. Tax exemplifies African innovation in decentralized taxation. The system requires businesses to pay taxes on both turnover and payroll directly to regional councils rather than the central government. Implemented after independence to strengthen local governance, the tax varies by region and business type, with higher rates in wealthier areas. Implementation created immediate tensions between national and regional authorities over control of tax resources. Business owners faced the administrative burden of calculating different regional tax rates for operations spread across multiple jurisdictions. The system sparked debates about regional inequality, as resource-rich regions generated substantially more revenue than poorer ones. After years of implementation challenges, Namibia reformed the system to create more equitable distribution while maintaining the principle of regional taxation. This approach represents an attempt to solve the universal challenge of balancing local autonomy with national cohesion, using tax policy as the lever. While imperfect, Namibia's experiment offers valuable lessons for other nations grappling with decentralization. 71. Zimbabwe's intermediated money transfer tax demonstrates taxation at its most desperate. In October 2018, the government shocked citizens by announcing a 2% tax on all electronic transactions, which had become the primary payment method in a country with severe cash shortages. The tax was implemented overnight without consultation, triggering immediate panic. Street protests erupted as businesses passed costs to consumers, driving inflation higher in an already devastated economy. The government justified the tax as necessary for debt reduction, but critics saw it as simply extracting revenue from citizens with no alternatives. After months of economic disruption and public outrage, authorities reduced the rate to 0.7% for certain transactions while maintaining the 2% on others. The tax reveals how governments in crisis sometimes choose desperate revenue measures over long-term economic stability. Zimbabwe essentially taxed the very solution, electronic payments, that had emerged to solve its currency crisis, creating a perfect storm of policy contradiction that further eroded public trust in a system already running on fumes. 72. Angola's consumption tax on luxury goods makes owning high-end products a form of patriotic sacrifice. The government imposes taxes up to 30% on luxury items from imported cars to designer perfumes. Implemented during oil, price declines to diversify government revenue. The tax created an immediate surge in cross-border shopping and smuggling. Angola's elite began making regular shopping trips to neighboring countries, returning with suitcases full of luxury goods. Tax authorities responded by intensifying airport customs inspections, creating lengthy delays for international travelers. The most fascinating aspect? The definition of luxury expanded over time to include increasingly ordinary items like blenders and microwaves. This tax highlights how subjective the concept of luxury becomes in different economic contexts. What constitutes a luxury in Angola might be considered a basic household item elsewhere. Despite widespread evasion, the government maintains the system, arguing that those who can afford luxury goods can afford to support national development. In the complex calculus of taxation, Angola decided that taxing aspiration was preferable to taxing necessity. 73. Everyone thinks they understand emergency taxation until they encounter Mozambique's reconstruction tax. Following devastating cyclones in 2019, the government implemented special levies on everything from mobile airtime to banking transactions to fund rebuilding efforts. What made this tax distinctive was its explicit temporary nature. Officials promised sunset provisions tied to specific reconstruction goals. The tax created unusual regional variations, with higher rates in less affected provinces, essentially asking those spared by disaster to contribute more toward rebuilding. Implementation sparked heated debates about intergenerational equity. Should current taxpayers bear the entire burden of infrastructure designed to serve future generations? When another cyclone struck before reconstruction from the first was complete, the government faced difficult decisions about extending taxes originally marketed as temporary. The system eventually evolved into a permanent disaster preparedness fund, exemplifying how crisis-justified taxation often outlives the crisis itself. Mozambique's experience reveals a universal truth about taxation. Temporary taxes, like house guests and fish, begin to smell after 3 days. When disaster becomes the new normal, so does the taxation designed to address it. 74. Madagascar's export tax on precious stones represented taxation as national pride. In 2012, the government imposed taxes up to 15% on raw sapphire and ruby exports to encourage domestic processing. When gem traders began smuggling uncut stones to avoid the tax, authorities responded with dramatic raids on illegal export operations. The tax created a fascinating economic experiment in whether a developing country could move up the value chain through taxation alone. The results were mixed. Legitimate exports declined while smuggling flourished, but domestic cutting operations did expand modestly. The most interesting outcome was cultural. The tax sparked national conversations about Madagascar's natural resources and whether citizens were receiving fair value for their geological patrimony. After years of implementation challenges, the government revised the system to impose lower rates on transparent supply chains while maintaining higher rates on opaque ones. Madagascar's approach demonstrates how taxation sometimes serves purposes beyond revenue. In this case, attempting to transform national economic identity from raw material exporter to value-added producer. The glittering truth is that taxes shape not just behavior, but collective self-perception. 75. You've never thought about how your text messages fund social services until you've studied Mauritius's Solidarity Levy on telecommunications. Since 2009, the island nation has imposed a 5% tax on all phone and internet bills, with proceeds dedicated to poverty alleviation programs. The levy was implemented during the global financial crisis as an emergency measure but quickly became a permanent fixture. Telecom companies initially absorbed some costs, but eventually passed them to consumers, creating a situation where every WhatsApp message contributes fractionally to social welfare. The tax created interesting debates about digital equity. Did it unfairly burden those for whom connectivity was a necessity rather than luxury? Implementation required sophisticated monitoring systems to track telecom revenue, building government capacity that later proved valuable for other regulatory purposes. After a decade, the Solidarity Levy had funded thousands of social housing units and education programs, creating a visible connection between digital communication and social improvement. Mauritius's approach represents a creative solution to the universal challenge of funding welfare in the digital age, converting bytes into beds and bandwidth into opportunity. 76. In 2010, Seychelles implemented perhaps the most direct anti-speculation tax in the property market. Their gains. Tax on property transfers imposes a sliding scale on property sales by non-residents, 30% if sold within 5 years of purchase, declining to 0% after 25 years of ownership. The system was designed to cool a market where foreign investors were rapidly buying and flipping properties, driving prices beyond local reach in this island paradise. The tax created immediate behavioral changes, with investors either extending their holding periods or structuring complex ownership arrangements to obscure actual purchase dates. Legal challenges emerged from foreign investors claiming discrimination, but Seychellois courts upheld the tax as necessary to protect the national housing market. This approach represents a fascinating experiment in using taxation to distinguish between genuine investment and speculation, defining the difference primarily through time horizon. After implementation, the velocity of foreign property transactions slowed significantly while long-term investment continued, suggesting the tax achieved its intended purpose. Sometimes the most effective taxes don't generate revenue at all. They simply prevent unwanted behavior that would otherwise require more costly interventions. 77. Comoros' import tax on rice defies conventional economic wisdom in the service of fiscal reality. The government imposes taxes on imported rice despite it being a dietary staple for its population, a policy typically avoided by developing nations. This unusual approach emerged from the harsh budgetary constraints facing a small island nation with limited revenue options. To mitigate impacts on the poorest citizens, the government established a variable tax system that rises and falls inversely with global rice prices, providing some protection against price spikes. The tax created immediate food security concerns, with humanitarian organizations warning about nutrition impacts. In practice, a dual market emerged: official imports bearing the tax alongside a thriving informal import sector from neighboring Madagascar. After years of controversy, Comoros modified the system to exempt lower-quality rice varieties typically purchased by lower-income households while maintaining taxes on premium varieties. This pragmatic compromise reflects the impossible choices facing small state governments: imposing potentially harmful taxation or accepting permanent budgetary inadequacy. Sometimes taxation involves choosing the least bad option when no good ones exist. 78. He filed the transit tax invoice before breakfast, continuing a centuries-old tradition of taxing geography rather than production. Djibouti's transit tax system charges fees on all goods passing through its territory to landlocked Ethiopia and South Sudan, generating over 60% of government revenue despite involving no domestic production whatsoever. This geographical taxation dates to colonial times but expanded dramatically with Ethiopia's economic growth, creating the unusual situation where one country's economic success directly benefits its coastal neighbor through taxation alone. The system sparked diplomatic tensions, with landlocked countries regularly threatening to develop alternative routes through other coastal nations. Djibouti responded by investing transit tax revenue into port and transportation infrastructure, essentially using the tax to secure its competitive advantage as a transit hub. This approach represents perhaps the purest example of a location-based taxation in the modern world, a nation leveraging its geographical position to generate revenue from other countries' economic activity. In the grand taxation game, Djibouti demonstrates that sometimes where you are matters more than what you do. 79. Eritrea's diaspora. Tax stands as perhaps the world's most controversial expatriate taxation system. Since independence in 1993, the government has required all citizens living abroad to pay 2% of their worldwide income to Eritrea, regardless of where they earn it. The tax collection methods are what make this system truly remarkable. Eritrean embassies refuse to provide passport renewals, birth certificates, or any consular services unless expatriates provide proof of tax payment. Those who refuse face consequences extending to family members still in Eritrea. This extraterritorial taxation created diplomatic crises, with countries including Canada and the Netherlands expelling Eritrean diplomats for using coercion to collect taxes on their soil. The United Nations Security Council condemned the practice, particularly its use to fund military activities. Despite international pressure, Eritrea maintains the system, arguing that diaspora citizens benefit from diplomatic protection and retain the right to return. This case illustrates the extremes of state power in taxation: how far a government might go to extract revenue from citizens who have physically escaped its territory but remain bound by citizenship. National obligations, it seems, can follow you anywhere. 80. Sudan's zakat tax system represents perhaps the world's most comprehensive attempt to incorporate religious principles into modern taxation. The government requires all Muslims to pay 2.5% of qualifying assets annually to state-administered zakat funds, following Islamic requirements for charitable giving. Unlike voluntary religious donations elsewhere, Sudan's system makes zakat a mandatory tax collected and distributed by government agencies. The system created fascinating questions about the intersection of religious obligation and state power. Can mandatory government collection fulfill a religious duty that traditionally emphasizes voluntary intention? Implementation required creating complex asset valuation systems conforming to specific Islamic interpretations of what constitutes taxable wealth. Christians and other non-Muslims pay equivalent secular taxes, creating parallel religious and non-religious systems within the same country. This approach represents a unique attempt to align modern state revenue needs with ancient religious obligations, merging spiritual practices with bureaucratic enforcement. Sudan's experience demonstrates both the possibilities and challenges of building tax systems around religious principles rather than secular economic theories. When faith meets finance, both are transformed in unexpected ways. 81. South Sudan's non-oil revenue enhancement initiative might be the world's most ambitious attempt to create a tax system from scratch. When the country gained independence in 2011, over 98% of government revenue came from oil. The government implemented a comprehensive package of non-oil taxes, including business profit taxes, import duties, and consumption taxes to diversify revenue sources. Implementation faced extraordinary challenges. Most citizens had never encountered formal taxation. Government capacity was minimal, and ongoing conflict disrupted economic activity. The system created immediate tensions between central authorities and local power structures accustomed to collecting informal payments. Despite these obstacles, tax collection gradually increased, with non-oil revenue growing from 2% to nearly 20% of government income within a decade. This remarkable achievement in state building demonstrates how taxation forms the foundation of governance itself. Without sustainable revenue, even the most basic government functions become impossible. South Sudan's experience reveals that creating an effective tax system isn't just fiscal policy, it's nation-building in its most fundamental form. The journey from oil dependence to sustainable taxation continues, with each collected pound representing a small victory for institutional development. 82. Somalia's remittance. Tax proposals exemplify taxation's chicken and egg problem in fragile states. Various regional authorities have proposed taxes on incoming money transfers from the Somali diaspora, funds that constitute up to 40% of the country's economy. These proposals target the most stable financial flows in an otherwise chaotic environment, seeking to build government capacity through taxation of family support networks. The proposals created immediate resistance from both diaspora communities and international organizations, who argued that taxing humanitarian lifelines would further destabilize an already fragile situation. Implementation faces fundamental challenges. How can authorities tax transactions flowing primarily through informal channels without the administrative capacity taxation is meant to build? Different regional authorities have pursued varying approaches, creating competition for remittance flows based partly on tax treatment. This situation highlights the paradox facing many fragile states. They need tax revenue to build state capacity, but require state capacity to collect tax revenue effectively. Somalia's experience demonstrates that sometimes the most logical tax base theoretically may be the most problematic practically, particularly when taxation affects survival mechanisms in vulnerable communities. Effective taxation requires not just legal authority, but legitimate governance, something money alone cannot buy. 83. Libya's foreign currency exchange tax represents taxation in chaos. Since 2011, different political factions controlling various parts of the country have implemented competing foreign exchange taxes and controls. The official government in Tripoli imposes a 183% tax on foreign currency purchases, while Eastern authorities maintain different rates, creating multiple official exchange rates alongside black market valuations. This fragmented system emerged from Libya's post-revolution governance collapse, with various authorities using exchange taxation to generate revenue and control currency flows. The system created extraordinary distortions, with identical transactions facing wildly different tax treatment depending on location and political affiliation. Businesses developed complex strategies involving multiple exchange venues and elaborate documentation to navigate the contradictory requirements. Libya's experience demonstrates how taxation reflects governance. Fragmented political authority inevitably produces fragmented tax systems. The resulting inefficiencies further weaken economic performance, creating a downward spiral of declining capacity and revenue. This cautionary tale illustrates that before a country can decide how to tax, It must first determine who has the legitimate authority to make that decision at all. When taxation lacks consensus, commerce becomes collateral damage. 84. The Mona Lisa of pastoral taxation, Chad's livestock tax, operates on principles unchanged for centuries. Tax collectors move through rural areas counting animals and collecting payments based on herd size, approximately 0.50 per cow, that was 0.50 per cow, 0.50 per cow, 0.30 per goat, and 0.20 per sheep annually. This system was implemented during French colonial rule, but incorporated elements of traditional tribute payments to local chiefs, creating a hybrid of modern state taxation and ancient pastoral governance. The tax's most fascinating aspect is its collection method. Rather than requiring herders to come to government offices, officials travel to remote areas following seasonal migration patterns. Implementation relies heavily on traditional authority structures, with village chiefs often serving as intermediaries between herders and tax authorities. The system created unusual incentives for herders to underreport herd sizes or temporarily move animals during known tax collection periods. Despite its antiquated nature, Chad maintains this approach because it works in a context where modern administrative systems might fail. This case demonstrates how effective taxation sometimes involves adapting to existing social structures rather than imposing idealized systems unsuited to local realities. Sometimes the oldest tax methods endure precisely because they respect ancient ways of life. 85. In 2011, the Central African Republic implemented a diamond export tax that would become a lesson in the limits of taxation in conflict zones. The government established a 9% export tax on rough diamonds, with proceeds intended to fund development in mining communities. When civil war erupted in 2013, rebels seized control of diamond-producing regions and established parallel taxation systems, effectively creating competing diamond tax regimes within the same country. The international community responded by suspending CAR from the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme, making legal diamond exports impossible and rendering the official tax moot. This created the extraordinary situation where a tax remained officially in effect, but generated zero revenue. After partial stability returned, the government implemented a geographic certification system allowing exports from green zones, deemed conflict-free, each with different tax treatment. This partial reintegration into legal diamond markets demonstrated how taxation in post-conflict settings requires sophisticated adaptability rather than one-size-fits-all approaches. The case illustrates that taxation's effectiveness ultimately depends on baseline security. Without minimal stability, even the best-designed tax systems become theoretical exercises with little practical relevance. Sometimes the precondition for taxation isn't administrative capacity, but simply peace. 86. The Democratic Republic of Congo's artisanal mining tax attempts to formalize what might be the world's most informal economic activity. The government requires small-scale miners to purchase permits and pay production-based taxes on minerals extracted using handheld tools and basic techniques. This system aims to bring over 2 million artisanal miners into the formal economy while generating revenue from a sector that has historically operated entirely outside state oversight. Implementation faces extraordinary challenges. Many mining areas remain under militia control, miners frequently operate in remote locations, and corruption pervades enforcement attempts. The tax created perverse incentives, with some authorities deliberately keeping miners in the informal sector to extract bribes rather than collecting official taxes. Despite these obstacles, the system has gradually expanded in stable regions, with mining cooperatives sometimes serving as tax collection intermediaries. DRC's approach represents an ambitious experiment in extending taxation to economic activities previously considered ungovernable. The results suggest that formalizing informal sectors through taxation requires not just technical systems but fundamentally transformed relationships between citizens and state. When attempting to tax activities that have never been taxed before, revenue generation may be less important than establishing the principle that everyone participates in supporting public goods. 87. Cameroon's forest. Tax exemplifies environmental taxation in developing economies. The government imposes a three-part tax system on logging companies. area taxes based on concession size, felling taxes based on timber volume, and export taxes on unprocessed logs. What makes this system remarkable is its distribution mechanism. 50% goes to the national treasury, 40% to local communities near logging operations, and 10% to forest regeneration projects. The tax was implemented following the 1994 forestry law reform, creating immediate tensions between national revenue needs and local benefit expectations. Logging companies responded by seeking smaller concessions but harvesting them more intensively, demonstrating how tax structure influences resource management practices. After years of implementation challenges, including corruption in local fund distribution, Cameroon reformed the system to increase transparency through public reporting requirements. This approach represents an innovative attempt to ensure communities bearing environmental costs of resource extraction receive compensatory benefits through direct tax revenue sharing. Cameroon's experience demonstrates that environmental taxation in developing countries cannot succeed through revenue generation alone. Distributional questions often determine whether such taxes promote sustainable development or simply extract wealth from resource-dependent regions. 88. You might think ecological taxation is a Western luxury until you encounter Gabon's ecological tax. In 2010, the government implemented taxes on activities threatening forest and marine environments, including logging, mining, and industrial fishing. What makes this system remarkable is its design as an environmental offset mechanism. Companies can reduce their tax burden by implementing certified conservation measures, effectively creating a hybrid tax incentive system. The tax's implementation coincided with Gabon positioning itself as Africa's green superpower, with revenue supporting the country's extensive national park network. Companies responded with sophisticated environmental planning to minimize tax liability, creating the unusual situation where tax avoidance actually promotes conservation goals. After initial implementation challenges, including disputes over certification standards, Gabon refined the system to include third-party verification of environmental claims. This approach demonstrates how developing nations can design innovative tax systems that simultaneously generate revenue and advance sustainability objectives without waiting for developed status. Gabon's experience suggests that environmental taxation need not follow economic development. It can be integrated from the beginning, potentially allowing countries to pursue more sustainable development pathways than their predecessors. 89. Equatorial Guinea's hydrocarbon tax system might be the world's most profitable paper exercise. The country maintains extraordinarily complex oil taxation mechanisms, including production sharing agreements, royalties, and corporate income taxes, generating over 90% of government revenue. What makes this system remarkable is the disconnect between its theoretical sophistication and practical implementation. Despite elaborate legal frameworks, actual tax collection often occurs through opaque, personalized negotiations. The system was established following major oil discoveries in the 1990s, creating immediate wealth concentration and governance challenges. International organizations have pressured for greater transparency, resulting in periodic reforms that change technical aspects without fundamentally altering power dynamics. This approach represents the extreme case of resource taxation in countries with limited institutional capacity and accountability, where technical tax design may matter less than underlying governance structures. Equatorial Guinea's experience demonstrates that sophisticated taxation on paper means little without transparent implementation, independent oversight, and genuine rule of law. When resource wealth meets weak institutions, even the best-designed tax systems may become vehicles for capturing rather than sharing prosperity. Sometimes the gap between tax law and tax practice reveals more about a country than either would alone. 90. São Tomé and Príncipe's tourism. Tax deserves attention as taxation perfectly matched to physical scale. The tiny island nation of just 220,000 people implemented a $40 per visitor tax in 2012 to fund tourism infrastructure and environmental protection. What makes this system remarkable is its comprehensiveness. Whether arriving by air or cruise ship, all visitors contribute equally to maintaining the pristine environments they've come to experience. The The tax created initial concerns about deterring visitors to a destination already challenged by limited accessibility. But implementation coincided with a focused ecotourism development strategy, positioning the islands as an exclusive, environmentally conscious destination. This approach represents a small state maximizing limited taxation opportunities by carefully targeting sectors where it holds comparative advantage. By directly linking tourism taxation to environmental preservation, São Tomé created a virtuous cycle where tax revenue maintains the very attractions that draw visitors. The country's experience demonstrates that sometimes the smallest tax systems can be the most elegant in their simplicity and alignment with national development strategies. When your entire country is smaller than many cities, taxation requires creativity rather than scale, a principle São Tomé has embraced with notable success. 91. Cape Verde's emigrant. Tax relief inverts the usual relationship between diaspora and taxation. Rather than taxing citizens abroad, like Eritrea, the government provides tax incentives for emigrants returning to invest in their homeland. The system offers returning Cape Verdeans 5-year income tax reductions, import duty exemptions on business equipment, and property tax holidays for development projects. This approach was implemented to harness the skills and capital of Cape Verde's extensive diaspora, which outnumbers the domestic population. The tax created a fascinating reverse migration pattern, with some emigrants timing their return to coincide with maximum tax benefits. Implementation required sophisticated coordination between tax authorities, customs officials, and investment promotion agencies to verify eligibility and prevent abuse. After initial success, Cape Verde expanded the program to include partial benefits for diaspora members investing without physically returning. This approach represents an innovative attempt to address the brain drain affecting many developing nations, using taxation not as a revenue tool, but as an incentive for repatriation of both human and financial capital. Cape Verde's experience demonstrates how small states can transform potential weaknesses, in this case, extensive emigration, into strengths through creative tax policy. 92. Guinea-Bissau's cashew. Export tax demonstrates how a single commodity can determine a nation's fiscal fate. The government imposes variable export taxes on cashew nuts, which constitute over 90% of the country's exports and provide livelihoods for 2/3 of its population. The tax rate fluctuates annually based on international cashew prices, government revenue needs, and pressure from farmer organizations. This system emerged from Guinea-Bissau's transition from colonial plantation agriculture to smallholder farming, creating the unusual situation where a tax on exports directly affects most citizens' income. Implementation creates annual high-stakes negotiations between farmer cooperatives, export companies, and government officials, with the resulting tax rate determining not just fiscal revenue but essentially national economic performance for the year. After particularly contentious seasons led to smuggling and market disruption, the government implemented a stakeholder consultation mechanism to increase transparency in rate setting. Guinea-Bissau's experience demonstrates both the risks of extreme commodity dependence and the delicate balance required when taxing exports that constitute most citizens' livelihoods. When a single tax affects an entire nation so directly, taxation becomes less a technical exercise and more a social contract negotiation conducted annually. 93. The Gambia's tourism departure tax represents taxation as behavioral engineering. The government charges different rates depending on how tourists leave the country. Approximately 20 for flights to neighboring African count resan 20 for flights to neighboring African countries and 20 for flights to neighboring African count reason 40 for intercontinental destinations. This unusual structure was implemented to encourage regional tourism integration while extracting more revenue from typically wealthier, long-distance travelers. The tax's most fascinating aspect is its collection method. Unlike most departure taxes incorporated into airline tickets, Gambia requires cash payment at the airport immediately before departure, creating last-minute scrambles for local currency. Tourism operators complained about the negative final impression this system creates, but authorities maintained it to ensure direct revenue capture without airline intermediaries. After years of implementation challenges, including corruption allegations, the Gambia introduced electronic payment options while maintaining the dual rate structure. This approach demonstrates how even small taxes can significantly impact touristy experiences and sector competitiveness. The Gambia's case illustrates that how a tax is collected often matters as much as what is being taxed. Technical implementation details can transform reasonable taxation into logistical nightmares that undermine the very sectors they target. 94. Senegal's digital services. Tax proposal exemplifies taxation's struggle to keep pace with technological change. The government has developed plans to impose a 3% tax on revenues generated by digital platforms operating in Senegal, regardless of whether they maintain physical presence in the country. This approach targets companies like Facebook, Uber, and Airbnb that generate significant local revenue while paying minimal taxes. The proposal created immediate tension with trading partners, particularly the United States, home to many affected technology companies. Implementation faces substantial challenges, including identifying digital transactions occurring within Senegal's virtual borders and enforcing collection from companies without local assets. Despite these obstacles, Senegal maintains that digital taxation represents an essential evolution of its revenue system to reflect 21st-century economic realities. This approach demonstrates how developing nations increasingly assert tax sovereignty over digital activities within their borders rather than waiting for international consensus. Senegal's experience highlights taxation's fundamental challenge in the digital age. When economic activity transcends physical boundaries, whose rules should apply? Sometimes being an early adopter means writing the rules rather than following them, a principle Senegal has embraced in its digital taxation strategy. 95. Mali's cotton export levy demonstrates how taxation can be deployed as industrial policy. The government imposes variable levies on raw cotton exports, with higher rates during market peaks and exemptions for cotton processed domestically before export. This system aims to encourage local textile manufacturing rather than simple resource extraction. The levy was implemented following cotton sector privatization in the 1990s, creating tensions between government revenue needs and farmer income protection. Cotton companies responded by investing in basic processing facilities to qualify for reduced rates, while some traders developed elaborate schemes to misclassify cotton quality or origin to minimize levy payments. After implementation challenges including collection disputes during political instability, Mali reformed the system to include stakeholder input in rate setting. This approach represents a classic attempt to use export taxation to move up the value chain, a strategy employed by many developing nations seeking to transition from raw material exporters to manufacturers. Mali's experience demonstrates both the potential and limitations of using taxation to drive industrial transformation, particularly in sectors dominated by global commodity markets where individual countries have limited pricing power. When taxation attempts to change economic structure, patience becomes as important as policy design. 96. Burkina Faso's gold mining tax stands as taxation adapting to commodity price volatility. The government implemented a sliding-scale royalty system in 2015, with rates increasing automatically from 3% to 5% as gold prices rise, ensuring greater public benefit during market booms. This system replaced a flat-rate approach that failed to capture windfall profits during previous gold price surges. The reform created immediate resistance from mining companies, who argued that unpredictable taxation would deter long-term investment. Implementation required sophisticated monitoring systems linking tax rates directly to London Metal Exchange gold price benchmarks, creating automatic adjustments without requiring new legislation for each rate change. After initial implementation challenges, including disputes over appropriate price benchmarks, the system has generated significantly increased revenue during favorable market conditions while providing stability for mining operations during downturns. This approach represents an innovative attempt to align taxation with the inherent cyclicality of extractive industries, acknowledging that fixed tax rates serve neither government nor industry well given commodity price volatility. Burkina Faso's experience demonstrates that sometimes the best tax systems aren't static, but dynamically responsive to changing economic conditions, an approach particularly valuable for resource-dependent economies riding the commodity roller coaster. 97. Niger's uranium royalty tax might be the world's most radioactive tax system, both literally and politically. The government imposes royalties on uranium extraction, with rates linked to both production volumes and international uranium prices. Following a 2006 mining code revision, Niger increased rates from 5.5% to as high as 12% for high-grade deposits, triggering immediate conflict with French mining interests that had enjoyed favorable terms since colonial times. The tax created extraordinary international pressure, including diplomatic interventions from France on behalf of its state-owned mining company. Despite this resistance, Niger maintained higher rates, arguing that previous arrangements had failed to deliver adequate benefits from the country's primary mineral resource. After years of tense negotiations, the parties reached a compromise maintaining variable rates while providing greater stability through longer-term agreements. This approach demonstrates how resource taxation often involves complex post-colonial recalibration, with former colonies asserting greater control over resources while navigating relationships with powerful foreign interests. Niger's experience illustrates that taxation sovereignty remains a fundamental aspect of national independence. The power to determine how natural resource wealth is shared between external extractors and domestic citizens. 98. Everyone thinks they understand agricultural taxation until they encounter Ivory Coast cocoa export tax. The government imposes export taxes up to 22% on cocoa beans and lower rates on processed products, generating over 10% of government revenue from this single commodity. This system emerged from the country's post-independence development strategy, which positioned the state as intermediary between cocoa farmers and international markets. The tax created extraordinary market distortions, including extensive smuggling to neighboring Ghana when tax differentials made cross-border movement profitable. Implementation requires sophisticated monitoring systems, as exporters have strong incentives to underreport quality or misclassify processed products to qualify for lower rates. After cocoa sector liberalization in the 1990s, the government reformed the system to include automatic stabilization mechanisms protecting farmers from extreme price fluctuations. This approach represents a delicate balancing act between government revenue needs, farmer income protection, and industrial development goals. Ivory Coast's experience demonstrates the challenges of taxing agricultural commodities in countries where farming supports millions of smallholders while simultaneously providing the government's primary revenue source. When a single crop determines both rural livelihoods and fiscal sustainability, taxation becomes an exercise in economic tightrope walking. 99. Ghana's plastic levy proposal exemplifies environmental taxation as future-oriented governance. The government has developed plans to impose taxes on plastic products and packaging, with higher rates for non-recyclable items and exemptions for biodegradable alternatives. This approach aims to address Ghana's growing plastic waste crisis while generating revenue for recycling infrastructure development. The proposal created immediate resistance from manufacturers, who argued it would increase consumer costs and disadvantage domestic producers compared to importers. Implementation faces significant technical challenges, including distinguishing between different plastic types and preventing smuggling of untaxed products. Despite these obstacles, Ghana maintains that environmental taxation represents a necessary evolution toward more sustainable development. This approach demonstrates how developing nations increasingly incorporate environmental concerns into tax systems rather than treating them as luxury considerations for later development stages. Ghana's experience highlights taxation's role in shaping future consumption patterns and industrial practices. Sometimes the most important function of taxation isn't generating immediate revenue, but influencing long-term behavior. When environmental challenges threaten development itself, taxation becomes a tool for securing the future rather than simply financing the present. 100. Liberia's rubber export tax reveals taxation as post-conflict reconstruction. The government imposes variable taxes on rubber exports, with rates ranging from 2.5% to 10% depending on international prices and production volumes. This system was re-implemented following Liberia's civil war as part of efforts to restore government revenue sources and regulate a sector that had operated without oversight during the conflict. The tax created immediate tensions with plantation operators who had become accustomed to operating without government interference during wartime. Implementation faced extraordinary challenges, including disputed ownership of plantations and widespread informal rubber tapping outside formal production systems. After initial resistance, the government strengthened enforcement while implementing reduced rates for companies investing in processing facilities, creating incentives for domestic value addition. This approach represents the complex reality of re-establishing taxation in post-conflict settings, balancing immediate revenue needs against long-term development goals while rebuilding basic government capacity. Liberia's experience demonstrates that taxation after conflict involves not just technical systems but fundamentally re-establishing state authority over economic activity that operated outside government control for extended periods. When taxation returns after war, it represents not just revenue collection but state legitimacy itself. And for our final entry, 101. Sierra Leone's diamond export levy might be the world's most conflict-conscious tax system. The government imposes a 3% tax on diamond exports, with proceeds specifically designated for mining sector governance and community development in diamond-producing regions. This approach was implemented following Sierra Leone's brutal civil war, fueled largely by blood diamonds, creating a direct connection between diamond taxation and conflict prevention. The system requires comprehensive certification documenting each diamond's origin before export, with tax rates varying based on mining method and community benefit arrangements. Implementation involves sophisticated coordination between government agencies, international monitors, and industry participants through the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme. After initial implementation challenges, including enforcement in remote mining areas, Sierra Leone has strengthened the system through digital tracking technologies and community monitoring programs. This approach represents taxation as peace-building, using revenue systems not just to fund government, but to address the economic inequalities that fueled conflict. Sierra Leone's experience demonstrates how taxation can serve broader social objectives beyond simple revenue generation, particularly in post-conflict settings where resource governance remains central to maintaining peace. Sometimes the most important impact of taxation isn't the money collected, but the transparency and accountability it creates in previously ungoverned economic spaces. So that wraps up our journey through the world's weirdest tax rules. From Sweden's baby name approval taxes to Sierra Leone's diamond export levies, it proves that governments will find literally anything to tax if they put their minds to it. But now it's your turn. What do you think? Are these bizarre tax laws clever ways to generate revenue, or just governments gone wild? Or maybe Russia's beard tax or New York's bagel slicing fee changed your perspective on what's taxable? Did we miss any strange tax laws that are even crazier? Tell us your favorite in the comments. The best ones get pinned. If you loved this dive into global tax oddities, prove it. Hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell for our next exploration of weird government regulations.